At the very end of 2022, I put out a video titled, "Is it worth it to play Flesh and Blood?" In it, I went over several aspects of the game aimed at giving potential new players an idea of what they'd be getting into so that they could decide for themselves whether this was a game they wanted to play or not. This video is going to be an updated version to the original. Over the past year and a half, Flesh and Blood has changed a reasonable amount with new products, a change in card design philosophy, and a rapidly expanding global player base. And so, I feel it's time to revisit this topic. And this time, I want to be a bit more thorough than I was before, because I very much feel that this question deserves more time and scope than I gave it originally. And so with this video, I'm going to attempt to help you, the potential new player, or even current player, answer the question, is it still worth it to play Flesh and Blood? Flesh and Blood is the most balanced card game that I have ever played, and to explain why, I need to break down how the game actually works. Flesh and Blood is a hero-based fantasy trading card game. You and one or more opponents choose your hero, gear them up, then face off against each other in a battle to the death. While most card games have you start at nothing and build up your resources over the course of the game, Flesh and Blood flips this on its head. In this game, you start at your strongest and get weaker as time goes on. This creates a unique and refreshing experience for both new and veteran TCG players alike. The best way to think about this game is that it's a fighting game in TCG form. You choose your attacks and blocks each turn cycle, refreshing and starting over again in what makes for a very rewarding back and forth system. Cards in this game have multiple uses, opening up a wide variety of decision trees with each hand. Most cards can be played for their abilities, be used as attacks and or defense, or they can be pitched for their resources. This, paired with each player drawing up to their hand size at the end of their own turn, rather than drawing one card a turn, creates a game system that is far more interactive than any other game I've played. In a lot of TCGs, if you have a bad hand, you're stuck praying that your top deck is what you need. But in Flesh and Blood, if you have a bad hand, you can just block with it, and you get a totally different hand at the end of your turn to use. Adding to the balance, Flesh and Blood also runs off action points. Use up your action point and your turn will end. But get more with the keyword go again, or just by getting more action points directly, and you can do more in your turn than you might otherwise. There are decks that can generate tons of action points or bypass them with instants, and so despite the limitations, you can still have incredible combo turns in this game. But having to actually work for those action points adds a level of balance to it. I think the best way to explain it is, imagine Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you get to play out a whole ton of cards on your turn, except there's actual checks and balances so that the games are genuinely interactive. One other unique part of this game is the pitch system. When you pitch a card for its resources, it goes into the pitch zone. Then, at the end of your turn, these cards go to the bottom of your deck, meaning that if the game goes long enough, you'll start seeing those cards again. This mechanic alone opens up a wild amount of possibilities in how you play, as you can choose to pitch your more powerful cards to set up for the late game if you so choose. And those are the unique mechanics of Flesh and Blood. I really want to stress that with all of it put together, it makes this game absolutely incredible. There is so much nuance, strategy, and even elegance in how this game plays, and out of the 6 card games I've played, it is by far the best one. And I haven't even touched on the best part, the heroes. Oh man, the heroes in this game are freaking awesome. You've got classics like warriors who buff their weapons and wizards who throw fireballs. Ninjas like to go wide with a lot of little attacks, while guardians power up and throw one giant, absolutely devastating attack. But then you've got mechanologists who feel more steampunk or cyberpunk than fantasy, but they are super fun to play with items, mech suits, and Tony Stark turning into Ultron. That's not a joke. That's literally what Teklavossin is. But there's still more. Runeblades use a mix of arcane and melee damage. Brutes just like to go unga bunga, and illusionists, the best class in the game as you can see by the wall behind me, conjure up spectral illusions to attack the opponent with. There's also talents, by the way. While Dorinthia is just a warrior, Bolton is a light warrior, giving him a bit more spice with his mechanics and card pool. So far, the talents we've got are Elemental, Draconic, Light and Shadow, and the newest one, Mystic. All of these feel incredibly flavorful and make the game that much more robust and interesting. No matter what kind of TCG player you are, you will find a hero you absolutely love. And while not all heroes are equal, there's a pretty wide number of good to great heroes in the game, and we see a lot of different ones winning events. Most of the time in Flesh and Blood, player skill matters far more than just playing the best deck. Master a hero and you've got a good shot of beating even your unfavorable matchups by skill alone. Although I won't lie, there are a couple of just bad heroes. Arachne Huntsman is a great example of a hero that's just kind of worse than the other options. However, even if you fall in love with a bad hero, that doesn't mean they will be bad forever. Azalea is probably the best example of this. Released in the second set, Arcane Rising, Azalea was the biggest joke in this game for like 4 years, but then Outsiders came out, giving her a ton of support. With that, some more support in the expansion slot of other sets, and a changing metagame, Azalea now finds herself as one of the best decks, at least at the time of making this video. LSS, the company and team behind the game, have made it very apparent that they care deeply for their heroes. Even if you pick up a currently bad hero, there is a very good chance they will receive buffs at some point in the future. Now, they might never be an an S-tier hero like what we saw with Azalea, but just the fact that you can be sure your hero won't be left completely by the wayside is incredibly reassuring. If you are getting into this game, I would highly advise that you do a little bit of looking into the different heroes and pick one that really speaks to you both in theme and gameplay. I highly recommend you check out the long but thorough video that Majin Bay did on this topic, as it's probably the easiest way for you to get a breakdown on all the heroes that currently exist. I'll link it down in the description, and while you're down there, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. This channel is fully dedicated to Flesh and Blood, so if you're interested in the game, you'll probably like the videos I make. Thank you very much. One other thing to note about the heroes in relation to fun and balance is the change in design philosophy from LSS. I did an entire video on this topic called The Powering Down of Flesh and Blood, which you should absolutely watch after this, by the way, but I'll quickly summarize here. Cards that start in play and stay in play, like your hero, weapons, and armor, are some of the most powerful cards in the game since you will have access to them right from the start. Older card design saw heroes that basically gave free access to the keyword Go Again, which is the most powerful keyword in the game. But due to an expanding card pool, LSS have since changed their design specifically on heroes and weapons to make it harder to get Go Again. As someone who has been playing since the earlier days, this is a very good thing. It makes the game far more balanced, as heroes like Chain, Briar, and Prism were all really powerful due to how free Go Again was for them. Again, if you want a full breakdown, you can go watch my old video, but I'll just say that Flesh and Blood has been in a much healthier spot with these design changes than it was before. And there is one other thing that is important to note about Flesh and Blood as a game though. While it is quite easy to learn the basic rules, it's a very difficult game to master. Not only is the game system deep and complex, but there's also just the fact that this game plays very differently from most others. Going from a game like Magic the Gathering to say Grand Archive will be fairly easy, as the games are almost the exact same in how they play, but come from either of those to Flesh and Blood and it's a whole different beast entirely. And personally, I think that's actually what makes it so refreshing and fun. You just can't get the same experience anywhere else, and the depth of the game really gives you something to sink your teeth into. With a unique game system, a wide variety of interesting and cool heroes, and a much more balanced design philosophy, I can very confidently say that Flesh and Blood is in the best spot it's ever been. While it can take a while to get really good, you have hundreds, if not thousands of hours to spend in the game before you're even close to being bored. And while sure, not everyone is going to like this game, I do think a lot of people will fall in love with it just as much as I did if they would just give it a try. And thankfully, it's easier than ever to do so. If there is one thing that has greatly improved in Flesh and Blood since my original Worth It video, it's the accessibility. Not only are there more ways to play the game, but there's also more products available to support them. In Flesh and Blood, there are 7 official formats of varying popularity. Sealed and Draft are the 2 limited formats, with Draft being a prominent competitive format. Classic Constructed is the most popular and most competitive format in the game, with heroes hitting Living Legend as its unique rotation system. Blitz is basically CC Light with smaller decks and half the hero health, while Ultimate Pit Fight is multiplayer Blitz. Commoner is, as its name applies, all commons and serves as a great budget format. But the last and newest format is the Living Legend format. This has recently been added to skirmishes, and it's basically Fab's version of Vintage, where every hero and card is legal, and so far, there's only a restricted list for a handful of them. This, on top of fan-made formats like Clash, means that Flesh and Blood will have a format for pretty much every type of player. And again, the most popular format by far is Classic Constructed, as this game is huge for competitive play. With a pro circuit and $1.5 million in prizing, Flesh and Blood is the game to play if you've got the itch to compete for top prizing. But even if you're someone like me who doesn't really go to the high level events but still likes to build and play competitive decks, then this game is right up your alley. And it's now way easier to hop into Classic Constructed as well as other formats than it ever has been. For the past few years, the only products available for this game were booster boxes and Blitz precons. Now, however, there's 2 new current introductory products, Armory decks and Round the Table, as well as First Strike decks aimed at teaching the game to new players coming soon. Armory decks are a new line of fully built, ready to play Classic Constructed decks. These aim to make the step into CC much easier. So far, we've only gotten the first one, KO, but the Bolton deck is releasing very soon, with Azalea following after. It also seems like new ones of these will be released every few months, keeping a steady stream of Armory decks to help onboard people into CC. I reviewed the first Armory deck, KO, and while the product as a whole left a bit to be desired, the deck itself is actually really strong for an entry-level product. While I wish it included a few extra goodies, these Armory decks are still a great entry point into Classic Constructed. Being able to just pick this up at an LGS and start playing makes it so much easier to jump into Fab, as building a deck as a brand new player is a lot. And these decks do pack some powerful new cards while also maintaining clear upgrade paths for those looking to get more competitive. But let's say Classic Constructed isn't your jam and you don't really want to be competitive at all. Well, there's Blitz, which is a more casual format since most competitive players don't play it. But you can also do what most casual Magic players do and play multiplayer. Ultimate Pit Fight is basically this game's version of Commander. And while these two games play very differently, the core of Commander, the drinks and pizza, shit talking and politics, basics is all still there in UPF. And it's now easier than ever to get into that format because of the Round the Table set. Coming in a set of 4 decks with a playmat and storage box, Round the Table is a UPF focused product with some very fun and unique heroes and plenty of multiplayer focused cards. All of the decks are very well constructed, and even just playing them out of the box is a ton of fun, although there is tons of room to also upgrade. And hey, you might just recognize one of the heroes, Professor Teklavasa. Now I'm gonna be real, one thing that's kind of a shame is that a good portion of the community doesn't really care for UPF. Flesh and Blood excels as a 1v1 game, and a lot of people can't be bothered with multiplayer, which I mean is fine, but as someone who enjoys both CC and UPF, I can confidently tell you that the format is amazing. And hey, if you don't believe me, Professor Teklavasa himself has done a couple gameplay videos, so you can always check them out to see if it interests you or not. I'd say that if you're a casual Magic player looking for something different and you've already got a group of Commander players, you should split around the table set and just give UPF a go. Between the many formats and the growing number of products that makes it insanely easy to jump into Flesh and Blood, there's almost certainly going to be something for you to enjoy to play in this game. Whether you just like draft, you only play casual UPF, you're a CC grinder, or like me, you play a bit of everything, there's a place and a hero for you here in Flesh and Blood. However, there is one big elephant in the room about the game: its price. Flesh and Blood is expensive is likely a line you've heard about the game. However, to say it's uniquely expensive is just not true, as the prices of the game are around the same as Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! That being said, you might still think that that makes the game too expensive, and you know, honestly, I'm not even gonna argue about it. For me, I don't think the game is too pricey at all, and I am fine with paying the price of competitive cards, but for others, even spending $15 on a single card is way too much. And well, there's no hiding from the fact that some cards in this game are a lot more than $15. If you want to build a top tier fully tuned deck as a brand new player, it'll cost you hundreds of dollars since the cards in top decks are in high demand. This is true in any player driven competitive game, and even more so for Flesh and Blood since the tournament pricing is insane. Like, we're talking big cash prizes and promos that are worth a lot of money. Even if we're excluding the World Championships and Pro Tours where you can earn $50,000 to $100,000 USD, even just winning a Pro Quest at your local game store will earn you a gold foil that's usually worth several $100s. All this is to say that even at the Armory level, lots of players want the best cards so they can have the best chance of winning, and so the price of the most in-demand cards will reflect that. However, there is one huge thing to note about the price in this game, and it's that unlike most games that have standard rotation, Flesh and Blood is a non-rotating game at its core, with a caveat that I will get to, and your cards have a lot more longevity because of it. This Viandal Spring Tunic cost me $275 Canadian, so like 18 bucks and a handshake in American. I bought this card over 2 years ago at a peak in its price, and it's since come way down from that. Not only were there less reprints of it at the time, but there were also just less chess pieces to compete with it. However, even though I paid top dollar for it, I don't regret the money I spent at all. Because it's a generic card, I've used it in like 20 different decks, and I'm still using it in my current favorite deck, Enigma. I genuinely feel that I've gotten way more of my money's worth out of this Tunic, especially considering I'm still using it. In fact, I'm probably going to be using it for several more years at least. In fact, like Tunic, the most expensive cards in this game tend to be generic since they can be played in anything. This does create a higher barrier to entry for competitive play, which the Armory decks seek to help with, but once you get the expensive generics, you've got them for any deck you want to build. Anytime I build a new deck, I don't need to add the price of Tunic or Command and Conquer, E-Strike, or Crown of Providence because I already have them. The equipment are especially great because they don't go into the deck. I sleeve all of them in black and I just keep them in a tray in my academic, pulling out the ones I need for whatever deck I'm playing. This means I only ever need one copy of any equipment. On top of that, a lot of these expensive cards tend to hold their value. Command and Conquer has always been a pricey card as most decks want 3 copies, but that means that if you've bought them, you don't need to worry about the value tanking to $5 suddenly. Sure, there may be reprints which can bring the price down, but even those don't completely destroy the value. Now, not every card in this game is going to retain value, as it's just not possible in a TCG since there's always new cards coming out. However, we are seeing that, like the heroes themselves, LSS wants their more rare cards to not be completely worthless, both in terms of monetary value and as game pieces. A couple great examples of this are the Diadem of Dream State and Arcanite Skullcap. Diadem was an illusionist legendary that was like $5 for the longest time because it just wasn't that great to run. But with Part the Mistveil, they've created Enigma New Moon, a young only hero that actually wants to use the Diadem. Sure, her being a young only hero means that the Diadem isn't ever going to be super expensive, as Blitz isn't nearly as popular as Classic Constructed, but at least it now has a home where it's actually playable. As for the Arcanite Skullcap, well, this card actually used to be over $200. It was printed in the second set, Arcane Rising, and because there was only 2 sets, it was the go-to headpiece for almost every hero until Uprising gave us Crown of Providence. Skullcap was then further pushed into irrelevance with Balance of Justice and heavy hitters, leading it to be as low as $15 to $20. However, something interesting just happened with this card. And I mean literally just happened. I'm actually writing this part after I had finished the script the first time because LSS just revealed the next set we're getting, Rosetta. This is an all-arcane set taking place in Aria with 2 new rune blades and 2 new wizards. But what's most interesting is that the Japanese printing of this set will have 2 extra legendaries, Shock Charmers, which is usable with the new lightning heroes, and the Arcanite Skullcap. I'd be willing to bet that this card will be useful against the 2 new wizards. Now obviously we have barely seen any of the set at this time of recording this, so I could be way off on this point, and if I am, you can come back and tell me how wrong I am. But I don't see why they'd be making sure there was a Japanese print of the card unless they knew it was going to be playable. And this really emphasizes the fact that even cards which are deemed unplayable for a period of time might just become useful again. We've also seen LSS bring back playability to entire card pools sometime after the original hero hit the threshold for Living Legend. Both Blitz and Classic Constructed have a point system known as the LL system, where a certain amount of points is given to a hero that wins an event. This can be as small as 5 for something like a Pro Quest or 100 for the World Championships. Once a hero hits 1,000 points in CC and 500 in Blitz, they're effectively rotated out with their signature weapons. However, it's just the hero and their signature weapons that leave. All other cards remain legal, although there might not always be a replacement hero in the format to use those cards for a while. But LSS have shown us multiple times that they will release other heroes, sometimes just a new version of the same character like in Prism's case, to reopen the card pool's use. And this is why I am personally fine spending a ton of money on the game, because I genuinely get years worth out of my cards. And even if some are rendered useless by the Living Legend rotation or by new better cards, that doesn't mean it will stay that way forever. On top of that, if I'm done using my cards, I can just sell them. Flesh and Blood has a really healthy market and players are willing to spend a lot of money to build their competitive decks. This means that if you ever want to sell out, you can actually get a fair amount of money back. I think that's the most underrated aspect of a game where cards hold value. Sure, it can be a lot to buy into, but you can actually get a lot back when you're looking to move on to a new hero or from the game entirely. Personally, I like it when TCGs have plenty of valuable cards, but I also know that not everyone feels the same. And hey, if you don't want to spend a lot of money, you can always play on a budget, since LSS has also been doing a fantastic job at providing budget and class-specific alternatives to cards like CNC and the legendary equipment. As the game gets older and more cards come out, there's just more options available, and I can confidently say that you can now build a much more powerful deck on a budget than you used to be able to. Pair this with the fact that they've increased the pull rates of Rainbow Foil legendaries while making the cold foil versions the chase copies, and you can build a fairly competent deck for relatively cheap. It won't be a top tier deck that will take you to the Pro Tour, but it'll let you have a fighting chance at your locals or against friends. And if you really, truly don't want to spend any money, you can just use Talishar. I'll link it down below, and while it's not the best way to play Flesh and Blood since the game was designed to be played in person, Talishar will work perfectly fine. It's also great for letting you test your decks or certain cards before you invest the money, which I think is actually really, really good. Because let's be real, even if you're cool with spending a lot, nothing is worse than dropping money on cards that you end up not even using. To summarize, Flesh and Blood has cards that can be quite expensive to some, but these are cards required for competitive play and not needed for casual play. If you just want to go to an armory or jam games with friends, grabbing an armory deck or grabbing around the table set is a fantastic way to get into the game. It's genuinely not that expensive to start playing the game. I wouldn't tell people interested in Magic to build a $1,000 modern deck when they're just getting into it, and the same can be applied to Flesh and Blood. Don't worry about the expensive cards until you know that you love the game and you want to be around for some time. If you're just playing for a few months, then these prices likely won't be worth it to you unless you've got money to burn. But for the average player like myself, who's not filthy rich, the longer you're around, the more worth it the price of the cards become. For me, the price of these cards are well worth it for how much use I get out of them, but you'll have to decide for yourself if you feel the same. And hey, say what you want about the price of singles, but at least Flesh and Blood boxes don't cost $500 for 12 packs. Most TCGs with big IPs are developed by large, faceless companies. Companies like Wizards of the Coast, Konami, and Bandai are all very large companies with thousands of employees. While the games they produce look and feel very professional and well made, there's always a noticeable distance between the company and the customers. And this is fine, at least until the company making the game decides to start seeing the customers as cash cows rather than supporters of their very business. Whether it's running every game they make into the ground, leaving the players high and dry, power creeping the game every single set just to sell packs only to ban the clearly broken card or power creep it again a set or two later, or just being Wizards of the Coast, I mean, seriously, over $500 for 12 fucking packs? You could get an entire case of Part the Mistveil for that price, which is 4 whole boxes, and you still have money left over. What I'm ultimately trying to get at here is that Flesh and Blood isn't made by some big corporation who views the audience as a wallet. This game is made by a small team in New Zealand, and it's run by people who genuinely want to make the best game they possibly can. And this is so noticeable when you play Fab. LSS is a very transparent company, and even though they don't get everything right on the first time around, there is a noticeable and continuous improvement in what they do. When the creator of the game and CEO of LSS, James White, speaks about this game, you can truly hear the passion in his voice and the conviction he has in his mission to bring people together in person.
To me, the true beauty of trading card games is actually that person-to-person interaction. It very much is like playing the game and seeing the world, traveling to these big events and meeting friends, whether on a domestic level or traveling internationally for the marquee events. So it's very much a culture, that in-person culture, and it's why we call the game Flesh and Blood, because it's about preserving that culture of the in-person interactions, the friendships, the adventures, and yeah.
Now listen, there have been products that are undervalued for what they cost, but the company has never released a product or done anything that felt intentionally anti-consumer. In an age where big TCG companies are very openly trying to milk as much money out of the players as possible, it is a huge breath of fresh air to play a game made by people who are genuinely down to earth and have some basic respect for their customer base. And while I'm sure not everyone cares about how a company acts as long as the game is good, I personally like knowing that I'm at least respected as a customer. I mean, it's all of us who support these companies and games. Over the years, I have spent tens of thousands of dollars in exchange for shiny cardboard, and all I want is to have a fun game to play and to not get screwed over by greedy practices. That's why I quit Magic in 2021 after a decade of playing and never looked back. And while sure, maybe in 15 years, James White moves on and the company slowly but surely deteriorates into a soulless corporate husk of its former self, but that's pretty far off, and it's not going to stop me from enjoying the game while it's great. Plus, it's not just the game and company that's great, it's the community as well, for the most part. As Flesh and Blood has grown, and let me tell you, it's growing, the community has gotten a bit more cringe, at least online. But it's just kind of the same crap that happens in any community as it gets bigger. The more people that enter, the more bad apples enter, and it just kind of stinks up the place a bit. But I would say that Flesh and Blood is still a far better online community than others, and more importantly, the in-person community is just as great as it's always been, at least by my experience anyways. I'm sure that some people have crappy LGSs or a couple of assholes that they have to deal with, but for the most part, Fab players are very friendly, very accepting and understanding, very adamant about bringing in new players, and best of all, we also know how to shower. Yu-Gi-Oh players, take note. There's no promise that Flesh and Blood will forever be run by a CEO and company that cares about the game as much as they do right now, and there's also no promise that the community won't devolve into a toxic cesspool. But at the moment, LSS is pretty great, and they genuinely do feel like a company who cares about the thing they're making. And as for the community, well, I mean, we're trying. A lot of people here do truly care about how we act to each other, and while we're all human and therefore messy, many of us do try to be reasonable, even to those that we might hate. And with years of other communities going to shit before us, hopefully we've been able to at least learn a thing or two. That being said, this is the internet. It's always going to be something of a shit show. When it comes to the question of whether it's still worth it to play Flesh and Blood, it really depends on what you're looking for. If you want a quick-paced game with flashy anime art where you can build a top-tier deck for a couple $100, then this game might not be right for you. Although, I would encourage you to at least try it if you can, because you might be pleasantly surprised at how fun it is to play. But if you're into fantasy, you like deep and complex TCGs that you can either play casually or sink your teeth into competitively, you want the people making the game to respect you as a customer, and you want to be part of something that's growing and will continue to grow, then Flesh and Blood is probably right up your alley. It's probably pretty obvious at this point that I am rather biased, as I am a fanatic for this game and have been doing this channel for over 3 years, but truly speaking, Flesh and Blood is an unbelievably amazing game. It is stupidly fun, and the mechanics are the most balanced of any game I've ever played. The art is beyond breathtaking, there are awesome Marvel cards to collect, and the heroes are all super unique and fun to play. There's an incredibly robust competitive scene with life-changing money to be won, as well as local armories for the more average player like myself. And with new products making it easier than ever to jump in, I mean, hey, you could at least try the game for cheap. I truly do think that Flesh and Blood is something special. I once thought the same thing about Magic the Gathering, and I think it says a lot that Flesh and Blood was the game that finally got me to leave that one for good. And so is it still worth it to play Flesh and Blood? Yes, more than ever. And I hope that with this video, I've convinced you of that too. And as always, a huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys really help me keep the channel running, and I appreciate every last one of you. So thank you to the GigaChad Saint, Geeks First, Elixir, Vinny, Smokeopotamus, John, Ty, James, Chemical, Bryant, Transient Fire, Dark Memoria, and Big Hungry. And we've got the Alpha Chads Thomas, Zajima, and Pavel. And finally, there's the Super Chads Bruno, Thal, Cece, Eric, Ben, and Yogbadoodles21. Thanks again as always. Stay Chadley, my friends.